The cold millionaire found his cleaner naked on the kitchen floor, then did what no one expected. The automatic doors of the Rios Collection's flagship hotel in Manhattan slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. The hour was late, long past midnight, and the place was supposed to be empty. Nathan Rios stepped into the dim, sterile corridor of the service kitchen. Overhead lights flicked on with his movement, casting a pale, artificial glow. Everything felt too quiet, like the silence before a storm. He hadn't planned to be here. In fact, no one even knew he was back in New York. His flight from Tokyo had landed early, but it wasn't the schedule that brought him here. It was a troubling report from one of his regional managers, a sanitation complaint, some staff logs that didn't line up. It gnawed at him the entire ride home. He hadn't told anyone, just redirected the car. His polished dress shoes tapped softly against the glossy tile floor. The tailored gray suit he wore caught faint reflections from the overhead LEDs. Everything looked in order, pans neatly drying, the faint chemical scent of bleach in the air, until his heel slipped. Just for a second, barely noticeable, but enough. Nathan looked down. A slick sheen of water glistened near the industrial freezer. He stepped forward, expecting a spill, but then he saw something strange. What looked like a bundle of cloth. Only it wasn't cloth. The shape was too round, too human. He crouched low. As his eyes adjusted, his breath caught in his throat. A girl lay curled on the cold tiles, barely covered by a damp kitchen towel, her uniform discarded in a sodden heap nearby. She looked less like an employee and more like someone the world had quietly forgotten. Nathan knelt beside her, pulse racing. He reached for her wrist. Her heartbeat was faint. But there, a glint caught his eye beneath the flickering light. An ID card. He picked it up. Sophie Lane, night shift cleaner. His jaw tightened. Without hesitation, he stood and rushed to the wall-mounted emergency phone near the service exit. "Yes, I need an ambulance. Female, mid-20s, unconscious, severe hypothermia, no visible injuries. Rios Collection, 5th Avenue branch, rear kitchen access." As he gave the details, his eyes never left her. Not just because of the shock of seeing someone like this on the floor of his luxury hotel. It was her expression. Even unconscious, her face looked guarded, like someone used to sleeping with one eye open. Footsteps pounded down the hallway. The overnight security guard appeared, panting. "Mr. Rios, is everything okay? Call the night manager. I want to know why a cleaner is lying unconscious and undressed on my kitchen floor." The guard hesitated, eyes darting between Nathan and the girl, then quickly vanished. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Nathan stepped aside as the paramedics worked, moving efficiently, wrapping Sophie in blankets, checking her vitals, fitting her with an oxygen mask. A young red-haired EMT glanced at him. "She's lucky. If you hadn't found her tonight, another hour, and we'd be looking at a very different outcome." "I own this place," Nathan said simply. "That explains why you're here this late," she replied, then paused. "But what about her?" He glanced at Sophie, her breathing shallow beneath the layers of emergency cloth. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I'm going to find out." The emergency room glowed in cold, clinical white. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mixed with the faint, rhythmic beep of monitors. Nathan stood against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the closed door in front of him. Sophie Lane was being kept alive. The fragile girl he'd found curled on his kitchen floor now lay under layers of care. Warmed blankets, IV fluids, oxygen. She was stable, but barely. He had seen enough in life to know that some disasters weren't caused by mistakes, but by silence. By no one noticing. No one asking. How long had she been lying there? An hour? More? In the kitchen of his own hotel. A nurse stepped out, nodding softly. "She's stable. We've started warming her body and administering fluids. She hasn't regained consciousness, but she's responding well." "Thank you," Nathan said, his voice low. He wasn't used to feeling this. He'd negotiated billion-dollar contracts, made decisions that changed lives in seconds. But standing outside the hospital room of a cleaner he'd never met, this unsettled him. He pulled out his phone and searched her name in the internal system. There wasn't much. Sophie Lane, born in 2000. Temporary contract via outsourced cleaning agency. Night shift, No formal employee record, no benefits. From a hallway manager, he got her listed address, a modest apartment in Elmhurst, Queens. Digging deeper, he found one dependent listed, Evelyn Lane, her mother. Diagnosed with late-stage cancer, undergoing chemotherapy at a local clinic. He paused for a long moment. No one in the hotel's management team really knew Sophie. She came in, cleaned, left, always on time, barely spoke. Some even assumed she didn't speak English. The only note on her file read, "Requested additional hours, denied due to contract limits." She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't complain. She just tried to do a little more, to be noticed, to stay, maybe to buy one more treatment for her mother. Hours later, when the light in the hospital room softened, the nurse nodded that he could enter. Sophie hadn't woken yet, but her color was returning, her pulse steadier. Nathan pulled a chair beside her bed. This girl, he thought, had no idea her silence had become the loudest thing he'd heard in years. He glanced at her ID badge again, then pulled out his business card. On the back, he scribbled 3 words, "You deserve better." As he left the room, the hallway outside felt colder than when he had entered. Not from the air, from something inside him that had begun to shift, quietly but irreversibly. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Nathan Rios' private office, casting pale streaks across the polished wooden desk. He hadn't slept, not a minute. His eyes were rimmed red, but his thoughts were sharp, too sharp to rest. In front of him lay 2 things, Sophie Lane's damp ID badge and a hastily prepared report from the night manager. He'd read it twice already, and it still didn't make sense. According to the log, Sophie had clocked out at 10:57 p.m. Her shift officially ended at 11. No flags, no complaints, no incident reports. No one saw her return, and yet just after 1 a.m., he'd found her unconscious and nearly naked on the kitchen floor. He called in Michael Bennett, his operations director. Within minutes, Michael arrived, holding a tablet. "Sir, I've pulled all internal camera footage." Nathan gestured toward the large wall monitor. "Show me." The footage began at 10:56 p.m. Sophie folded her apron, placed it into a small locker by the staff exit, and waved at a coworker passing by. She slung on her backpack and walked out. The door closed behind her. "That matches the clock-out time," Nathan said. "Keep going." Michael fast-forwarded. An hour later, the hallway camera activated again. Sophie reappeared. Same clothes, same bag. She re-entered through the side door. No badge swipe. No conversation. No witnesses. She didn't check back in. "No, sir." Sophie walked directly to the service kitchen. This time she wore gloves. The footage showed her pulling out cleaning supplies, setting down her bag, and beginning to scrub behind the industrial ovens. A zone not assigned to her. She worked with sharp intensity, like someone trying to prove something to a clock no one else could see. "She's trying to matter," Nathan said quietly. Michael nodded once. At 12:15 a.m., the automated sink sprayed with too much pressure. Water flooded the floor. Sophie slipped briefly, caught herself, and retrieved towels. She returned, soaked, and began cleaning up. Later, the camera caught her wringing out her drenched clothes in the utility sink. She re-emerged wearing only a spare apron, her uniform too wet to wear. Another 20 minutes passed. Then she moved out of frame. 10 minutes after that, the footage captured Nathan's arrival and the aftermath. The screen froze. The image. Sophie bent over a tiled wall, wiping with quiet precision. No one around. No one watching. Nathan was silent for a moment, then spoke, lower than usual. "She came back to clean something no one asked her to." Michael hesitated. "I spoke to one of her co-workers, Elena. She said Sophie volunteered for extra cleaning often. Said she needed the hours, but because she was contracted, we couldn't offer overtime. No benefits, no time cards. She came on her own." Nathan's jaw shifted, but he said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. No one asked, no one noticed. No one thought to wonder until it was too late. The hospital room glowed softly, the pale golden light of the bedside lamp casting gentle shadows on the curtain, swaying with the hum of the air system. Sophie was awake. She sat upright against a stack of pillows, IV still in her arm, eyes quietly fixed on the window. When Nathan stepped in, she turned, startled. Mr. Rios, her voice was barely a whisper, like breath dissipating into the air. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I didn't think anyone would find me like that. Nathan pulled a chair closer, not too close to overwhelm, not too far to seem distant. No need to apologize, he said gently. I'm not here to scold. She lowered her gaze, fingers tugging nervously at the hospital sheet. I just thought, if I waited for my clothes to dry and left quietly, no one would know. I didn't want to lose the job. You came back after your shift. No one knew. No one asked you to. Why? A pause, then a soft, tired sigh. I thought, if I cleaned better, did more, someone might notice. They said I couldn't have extra hours. No additional shifts allowed. But if the kitchen sparkled, maybe someone would let me stay longer. Maybe I could afford Mom's treatment next week. She gave a brittle laugh. Turns out I couldn't even afford to pass out properly. Nathan didn't smile. He looked at her, exhausted but unbroken. No one should have to work that hard just to be seen. She turned her face away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm not a victim. I just needed to feel useful. I don't want pity. Just a chance. Nathan leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but steady. You nearly froze to death trying to earn a few more unpaid minutes. That doesn't say anything about you. That says something about me, about the system I've built, a place where someone like you can show up every day and still be invisible. She looked at him, this time not with fear, but something closer to uncertainty. Why do you care? Because when I saw you on that floor, I didn't see a mistake. I saw a person, someone who should never have to be forgotten just because she works in silence. She was quiet for a long time. Then finally she nodded. I know, but I didn't have a choice. I couldn't watch my mother seize on the hospital bed because we couldn't afford the prescription. I couldn't do anything except scrub another wall. Silence settled again. No one at the hotel remembers my name, she whispered. But if the kitchen was spotless, maybe they'd remember my face. Nathan drew in a breath. You don't deserve to stay because the kitchen sparkles. You deserve it because you're a person. She turned to him, eyes rimmed red but dry. I don't want pity. I just need one chance, one that doesn't ask me to beg. Nathan stepped closer, finally sitting down. His voice was steady. Then I'll make sure that next time you work, someone sees you, not because you do twice the work, but because you deserve to be seen. 3 days after the hospital conversation, Sophie received a phone call from Nathan Rios' personal assistant. The message was brief. Mr. Rios would like to meet you at the main office, if you're feeling well enough. She hesitated. Part of her was still physically tired. But more than that, she wasn't sure if this meeting would be about being heard or politely dismissed. Still, she went, took the subway like always, carrying the same worn cloth bag she'd used since high school. When she entered the top-floor office overlooking Fifth Avenue, she felt small, but not out of place. Nathan stood as she arrived. Thank you for coming, he said, calm but firm. Please sit. She sat across from him, spine straight, eyes steady. I asked you here, Nathan began, because I believe you have something important to say, and we have something to learn. Sophie tilted her head slightly, unsure what he meant. I've been thinking a lot about what happened that night, he continued, about how you were overlooked, not because of anything you did, but because of a system I helped build. He pulled a slim folder from a drawer and slid it across the table. We'd like to offer you a new role, temporary if you're open to it, a position as an internal sanitation quality consultant. Your job would be to visit RIO's collection properties, observe cleaning procedures, identify inefficiencies, and propose changes. Sophie didn't respond at first. No one had ever asked a cleaner for their opinion. This isn't because of what happened to you, Nathan added. It's because you've lived something most of us haven't. She opened the folder. Everything was clear. Job description, 3-month term, salary twice her current rate. But the most important line, direct access to report findings to the executive board. Why me? She asked, voice calm but serious. Because I need someone who can see what our managers can't, Nathan said, and I believe you're the person who can do that. Sophie didn't answer right away. She sat still, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag, as if weighing something heavier than money. Sophie spent the entire night thinking before signing the job offer. She didn't sleep, not because of fear, but because something deep inside her still didn't fully believe it was real. Part of her thought it might vanish by morning, like it had never existed. On Monday morning, she arrived on time. She wore a plain white button-down, carefully ironed, hair tied neatly. She didn't have a formal ID badge, no title on a door, but an assistant quickly escorted her to a meeting room. There, Nathan simply said, "Do it your way, observe, record, be honest." Her first stop was the Bronx branch, a mid-size hotel with a cleaning team made up mostly of older women. They were surprised to see her, even more surprised when they learned she wasn't there to inspect them, but to ask how they felt. At first, no one said much. Some thought she was from internal audit. Others assumed she worked for the city. But when Sophie shared her own story of night shifts, gloves that never fit, late trains, they started to open up. "I bring my own rags from home," said a woman named Teresa. "The ones here tear after 2 uses. Sometimes I dry the floors with my shirt." Another cleaner, Malik, near 60, spoke with quiet resignation. "I've got arthritis, still have to crawl under refrigerators to mop. We don't have long-handled tool," and Sophie wrote it all down. No edits. No justifications. Just the truth, as she once wished someone would write hers. At the Queens branch, a young girl named Hannah told her she walked over 20 blocks home every night because there was no transportation support. "I asked for a MetroCard," Hannah said. "The manager said there's no budget for contracted staff." At a Brooklyn hotel, Sophie watched a janitor wrap his hands in plastic grocery bags in place of gloves. "Only get 1 pair per week," he muttered, "and they tear by Tuesday." Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't scold. She simply wrote, neatly, firmly, no embellishment, no dramatics. That evening, back in her small apartment, she sat at her kitchen table, notebook open, staring at the lines she had written. She wondered how many people had walked past these stories for years, without stopping. And because no one had stopped, she knew she had to. In the first few weeks of her new role, Sophie worked quietly but thoroughly. Her reports weren't just numbers. They were stories, snapshots of real life that spreadsheets often overlooked. Nathan read every word she wrote, not just to monitor progress, but because he found himself relearning how to listen, not through metrics or filtered updates, but through the voice of someone his system had long ignored. And from those moments of collaboration, between site visits and hurried notes, something between them began to shift, slowly, wordlessly, but undeniably. Until one evening after an inspection in Brooklyn, Nathan asked almost casually, "Have you had dinner?" And from that moment on, the kind where the breeze still carried traces of rain. Sophie had just wrapped up an inspection at the Brooklyn branch, spending nearly 3 hours talking with the cleaning staff and testing one of the newly proposed floor tools herself. Nathan had stopped by near the end of her visit, checking in to see how things were going. But instead of giving a polite goodbye, he hesitated before asking, "Have you had dinner?" Sophie studied him for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet, but I'm not sure there's anywhere around here good enough for Mr. Rios." Nathan smiled. "Lucky for you, I'm not Mr. Rios tonight, just a guy who cooks a little and wants to hear a story." They chose a small spot near the train station. Wooden tables, warm yellow lights, and the scent of real food, not perfume and plating tricks. Sophie ordered a vegetarian pho. Nathan got udon with a soft-boiled egg. At first, the conversation circled around work, her reports, missing gloves, schedule gaps. But then, like a door quietly opening, they began to talk about themselves. "I bet no one imagines you ever lived in a tiny apartment," Sophie said, her voice part teasing, part curious. Nathan thought for a moment, then answered, "My mom was a night nurse. She died when I was 17. Stroke, right after her final shift. My father wasn't around much after that. I dove into school, then work, then climbed so fast I forgot how to stop." Sophie nodded, saying nothing. She didn't offer a condolence. Some pains didn't need comfort, only recognition. "I used to sing while I cleaned," she said after a pause. "Not because I was happy, but because if I didn't sing, I'd cry. We lived in a cramped apartment, My mom sewed at home. My dad left when I was 8. I started working at 15, sweeping floors, washing dishes. I thought if I kept moving, maybe no one would notice how scared I was. Nathan didn't respond right away. He looked at her, really looked, and saw a person no longer trying to hold herself together. She was letting herself be seen. Maybe I used to think strength meant never stopping, he said quietly. But now, I'm not sure if that's strength or just avoidance. They sat in silence after that. Not the awkward kind, but the rare kind. The kind that feels safe. When a light drizzle began to fall, Nathan shrugged off his coat and offered it to her. Sophie shook her head. I'm not cold. It's not for warmth, he replied. It's because tonight you reminded me who I am. She smiled softly, for the first time since they'd walked in. That night, back at her apartment, Sophie opened her notebook but didn't write. She sat quietly, hand resting over her chest, where for the first time in years, the ache of exhaustion had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Peace. After that dinner, Sophie and Nathan didn't need many words to understand each other. Their meetings after inspections became more natural. A nod in place of praise, a glance in place of permission. They didn't define what was growing quietly between them. They didn't have to. Sophie continued her work with calm determination. Nathan kept listening, not as a CEO, but as someone slowly learning that true strength begins with presence. But as life often does, that fragile peace was tested, not by work, not by distance, but by something closer, something deeper. Family. It started with a cough, then came more, longer, sharper, until Sophie's mother's voice began to crack, and then fade altogether. The doctors said her body was no longer strong enough to handle the final rounds of chemotherapy. The decline didn't come suddenly. It crept in like dusk through a cracked door, slow, patient, unstoppable. Sophie kept working. She still visited the branches, still took notes, but the light in her eyes dimmed. Her voice is still clear, lost its edge. People began to notice her in ways they hadn't before. Her shoulders drooped more, her back curved slightly. She never complained, never asked for time off. She just wore down. Nathan noticed. After an internal team meeting, once the room had cleared, he asked her to stay. You're not okay, he said. Not like a boss, but like someone who had once known what it meant to lose. You don't have to hold it all together. Sophie clutched her notebook. I don't want to walk away from what I'm building. If I stop now, I'm afraid I'll be forgotten. You won't be forgotten, Nathan said softly. I'm here. You can take the time, days, weeks, however long, full pay. Your role will be waiting, but right now, you need to be somewhere else. Her eyes shimmered, but she nodded. A few days later, her mother was admitted to the hospital for the final time. Too weak to walk, too weak to eat, too weak to speak. All that remained were her eyes, dim but aware, still recognizing her daughter every time Sophie held her hand. That night, Sophie sat alone in the hallway outside the room, fingers laced in her lap, her head bowed. She didn't cry. She simply stopped. Then Nathan arrived. No call, no message. He just showed up. Wearing a simple gray shirt, no tie, carrying nothing but silence. He sat beside her without a word. Sophie didn't look up. But after a few minutes, she leaned slightly against him. A quiet, fragile motion that held more weight than any spoken grief. When the monitor inside began to beep longer than it should, when Sophie knew something had ended, she didn't move. She just held Nathan's hand, tighter. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He didn't say, it'll be okay. He didn't need to. His presence filled the space between them, not with words, but with understanding. That night, he brought her home. He didn't ask where she wanted to go. He didn't suggest anything. He simply walked beside her like a shadow that waited, that knew how to be still. When she fell asleep on the couch, too exhausted to undress, too drained to think, he gently pulled a blanket over her, then sat beside her and stayed. The small apartment settled into silence, filled only with the soft wind through the window and the steady breath of someone who had just lost her whole world. The days that followed passed like mist, soft, quiet, and full of empty spaces. Sophie didn't rush back to work. She spent each hour beside her mother's photo, sorting through papers, folding the hand-washed towels her mother had loved. She didn't cry much, but her eyes always seemed red, like the tears had dried before they ever fell. Nathan didn't pressure her. He didn't disappear either. He offered no advice, no attempt to make things better. He just kept showing up, on time, close enough, quiet enough. Each afternoon, a cup of tea, a message. If you need anything, I'm here. Nothing more, nothing less. Then on a windy Monday morning, Sophie walked into the office, unannounced. She wore a white blouse, her hair pulled low, her face still holding grief. But in her eyes was something sharp and steady. No announcements, no flowers. She walked into the office like someone who had weathered a storm and quietly chosen to continue. Colleagues who had once known her only as the cleaning consultant now looked at her differently. Not out of pity, but respect. Her reports had never been just about bleach, rags, or night shifts. They were about people, those who kept the world clean while no one was watching. The proposals she had quietly drafted before her mother's passing on working conditions, protective gear, mental health support, emergency access, and basic insurance for contracted staff were brought before the board. And for the first time in years, they weren't just acknowledged, they were implemented. Changes rolled out quietly but powerfully. New shift schedules with humane hours, regular health checks introduced, an emergency assistance fund established. No more solo night shifts without transport support. Small things, but they mattered. Nathan watched every step she took, not to oversee, but to learn. He didn't hover near her. He let her stand, lead, and rise in her own way. But in board meetings, he was always the first to support any proposal bearing her name. At the end of the quarter, a small ceremony was held in the ground floor hall, a space rarely reserved for logistics staff. This time it was. Soft lights, gentle music, and the names of those behind the scenes echoed proudly. Those who mopped floors, sanitized kitchens, and kept spaces livable. Nathan stepped up to the podium. No notes. He didn't need them. His voice was calm, brief, and heartfelt. We used to think the system runs because of the talent at the top. The truth is, it stands because of the quiet hands beneath. One person reminded me of that, not through speeches, but by showing up. Today I want to thank Sophie Lane, not just for keeping our floors clean, but for resetting how we see the world. Sophie stood still in the crowd, her face flushing pink, unsure whether to smile or cry. Applause filled the room, not for a survivor's tale, but for a real changemaker. After the ceremony, Sophie returned to the kitchen, the place where everything began. There, beside the mop rack, a small plaque had been mounted on the wall. For the ones we forgot to see. She didn't touch it, just looked for a long moment, long enough to honor what had been, then turned away, not to forget, but because she had already stepped into the life she'd once only dared to imagine. Not because she needed to hold on to the past, but because she had already stepped into something new, entirely on her own. After the ceremony, no one saw Sophie as an outsider anymore. She had become part of the system, not through a title, but through impact. But what stayed with Nathan most wasn't in the reports or speeches. It was in the way Sophie kept walking, kept listening, kept her quiet grace, despite it all. She hadn't changed because she was finally seen. She hadn't changed, but finally the world had turned to face her. And that's when Nathan knew. The feelings he'd carefully kept at a safe distance had quietly crossed every boundary. Not because Sophie was fragile, but because she was strong in a way he'd never known. Not because he wanted to protect her, but because he wanted to walk beside her, truly. The feelings between Sophie and Nathan didn't come like crashing waves. They arrived like morning sunlight, slow, steady, and real enough to need no label. They never said, "I like you" or "I love you." They just started spending time, not for work. A cup of coffee after meetings, a simple dinner at a small Harlem diner after branch inspections, an afternoon spent quietly on the rooftop, watching the city fade into dusk. Sophie wasn't hesitant, but she wasn't rushing either. Nathan didn't push. They both understood. What matters most doesn't need to be rushed. Once after a weekend review in the Bronx, Nathan handed Sophie an envelope. Inside was a check, enough to ease months of rent and hospital fees. She said nothing, read it once, then placed it back on the table. "Thank you," she said, her eyes steady, too tired to be angry, too proud to accept. Nathan frowned slightly. "It's not charity. I just want to help." Sophie looked up, eyes calm. "I know, but I don't need to be saved. I just need to be trusted." He said nothing more. But the next day when they met again, he didn't bring up the envelope. Instead, he handed her a cup of tea and told her how his mother once taught him to arrange flowers using only a teaspoon. She smiled, softly. From then on, the distance dissolved. No declarations, no titles. Just two people, once adrift, now quietly sharing peace. And somewhere between the silence and shared dinners, a quiet certainty began to form. Neither named it, but both recognized it. They didn't move in right away, but Nathan's visits became more frequent. And one day he brought his toothbrush and placed it next to hers. Sophie didn't say a word, just smiled and moved the toothpaste over to the right. There was no wedding, no press release, no ring. But every morning they woke up and found the other still there. That was enough. Nathan, once the head of a corporation, had learned how to be silent so someone else could speak. Sophie, once the invisible hand behind a mop, had learned how to let herself be loved, not as pity, but as a choice. Their love didn't come with confessions. No crescendo, just late afternoons walking quietly down a hallway. Just Sophie saying she was tired, and Nathan silently handing her a coat. Just Nathan skipping meals, and Sophie leaving him a cold lunchbox without saying a word. And just two people still spotting each other, first in a crowded room. Their love didn't need a wedding to feel real, because showing up each day had already become the truest promise. And then time passed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly lived. On a cold winter morning, exactly 1 year later, Nathan and Sophie attended the first staff breakfast held just for the janitorial team. The room wasn't grand, but it was warm. White tablecloths, fresh fruit, warm coffee. Most of all, smiles. Real ones. People greeted each other by name, not by job. Nathan stepped up to speak. No script, no speech. "Strength doesn't come from silence," he said. "It comes from staying, from truly seeing each other, and choosing not to turn away." After the applause, Sophie quietly slipped out. She walked down the old hallway, where she had once fallen, soaked and unseen. It looked different now. Non-slip mats, wall heaters near the sink, and beside it, a small wooden plaque. "For the ones we forgot to see." Sophie paused, fingers brushing the edge of the wood, but there were no tears this time, only peace. She didn't need the pain to remember where she had been, because now she was seen, named and chosen, and beside her stood the one who never left.